After deliberating for approximately 3.5 hours, the jury in Jim Huden's murder trial reached a verdict.
Please rise.
From the moment the jurors began filing in, Jim Huden seemed to know the news would not be good. In a whisper, he murmured, "I'm done." The rest of the proceeding, for Jim Huden at least, seemed to be a formality.
We, the jury, find the defendant, James Edward Huden, guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree as charged.
Huden would later be sentenced to 80 years in prison. But he'd scarcely been led from the courtroom before prosecutor Greg Banks turned his attention to a far more difficult case, the one against Jim Huden's alleged accomplice, Peggy Thomas. Charged with murder, there was only one piece of physical evidence tying Peggy to the killing of Russell Douglas. It was that single fingerprint of hers on a page in the gun owner's manual. The case against Jim was pretty strong.
Oh, yeah.
But the case against Peggy was pretty weak.
It was much more circumstantial.
It was Jean Huden, the wronged wife, who stood to be the strongest witness against Peggy Thomas. According to Jean, Peggy had told her everything that time Jean visited her out in Vegas.
The plan was Peggy had talked to Russell about she had presents for Brenna and the kids, and she had talked Russell into going out to the island to meet with them to pass these presents on.
Not only that, but Jean says Peggy told her that after dropping off Jim at the ambush location, Peggy drove off to create an alibi.
They made a point of her driving Jim's Sebring, the red car, to buy a pack of cigarettes and to make sure and get a receipt with the date and time on it so it would prove that she wasn't there at the time. Then she came back, picked him up, got rid of his clothes in a dumpster somewhere, and they tried to cover their tracks the best they could.
A powerful story, but the prosecutor knew that putting Jean Huden on the stand was risky. In the years after Jim fled to Mexico, Jean Huden got into trouble with the law over drugs and check forgery.
I've talked to Jean a lot, and I do believe her, but I also know what happens in a courtroom. And unfortunately, she is not as pure as the driven snow when it comes to what the defense attorney is going to be able to do with her.
Peggy was clearly on the fence as to whether or not to accept a deal or go to trial. What, she thought, if I just keep my mouth shut, it's worked all this way, I'm going to skate.
That would be my assessment.
Please rise.
On January 11th, 2013, Peggy Thomas, who'd been under house arrest for the past year, entered an Island County courtroom for another round of pretrial motions and encountered a familiar face. This time, her former lover, Jim Huden, took the stand to answer the one burning question that was no doubt keeping both the prosecutor and the defense counsel from sleeping at night.
Mr. Huden, if you were subpoenaed to...
Would Jim Huden agree to testify at Peggy's trial?
No, I assert my Fifth Amendment rights.
Though the two former lovers never seemed to make direct eye contact that day, Jim Huden made it clear that he, at least, was willing to carry their shared secrets to the grave.
Okay, I'll do the Fifth Amendment thing here.
Perhaps Jim Huden's gaunt appearance frightened Peggy. Maybe the prospect of having her wardrobe as well reduced to basic orange had a sobering effect. But 2 weeks later, just days before her trial was to begin, Peggy Thomas was back in court.
Cause number 11-1-109-.
This time, it was to plead guilty to a reduced charge.
We're here for a change of plea to an amended charge, rendering criminal assistance in the first degree with a special allegation that the defendant was armed with a firearm.
In pleading guilty to criminal assistance, Peggy Thomas was basically admitting to being an accessory after the fact.
Ms. Thomas, do you make this plea freely and voluntarily?
I do.
If you'd gone to trial against Peggy Thomas, you think you would have won? Because if you say yes, my next question is, then why didn't you?
My take on it was we had maybe a 50-50 chance of guilty versus not guilty, and so it was a roll of the dice.
Today, just a few hours ago, Peggy Thomas was formally sentenced to 4 years in prison. The sentencing was delayed so the family of Russell Douglas could attend. Conspicuously absent, however, was Russell's widow, Brenna.
I would still love to see her come forward and say, look, I really did make a mistake. I've got to own up to this, that I really did set it in motion, but I didn't mean to. I don't know that's going to happen.
Though neither Brenna Douglas nor her attorney have responded to Dateline's requests for a statement, in a lawsuit filed against an insurance company to collect on one of her late husband's life insurance policies, Brenna said, "I categorically state that I was not involved in the death of my husband in any way." And yet, even after the convictions of Jim Huden and Peggy Thomas, questions remain, and Brenna Douglas remains a person of interest. You anticipate ever charging her?
That's something I'm not going to talk about today. We still have questions.
And back in Punta Gorda, life goes on. Some of Jim Huden's former bandmates still make a living playing music, though not to the kind of crowds the exhibitionists used to draw.
Wilson Pickett and Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists too. Had to get that in. Long story, we'll talk about it later.
As for Jean Huden, the woman who protected a killer out of love even as she was being treated so badly, and who then finally stood up for herself and exposed him, the prosecutions of Jim Huden and Peggy Thomas represent the end of something sad, and maybe the start of something better.
I'm tired of paying for what they did, so hopefully I'll be able to move on now, and I can pick up the pieces, stay with Bill and kind of try and have a normal life again.